Welcome back. I'm Rob Campbell of the Wildlife Habitat Council. I hope you have enjoyed your programming so far. We still have many more great ideas and speakers to share with you, including our next session, Crab versus Corona, the unlikely creature that saved us from COVID-19. I'd like to now introduce David Wheeler, the Executive Director of Conserve Wildlife Foundation, and Stephanie Feigin, a wildlife ecologist from Wildlife Restoration Partnerships. And now I will turn it over to you, David. I'll be back for the Q&A.
Great, thank you so much, Rob. And welcome everybody, and thank you to Wildlife Habitat Council for hosting this. Stephanie and I are pleased to present about a story that is really in many ways unique within the wildlife world, but also speaks to a number of broader issues, particularly as humans and wildlife interact, but in good ways and bad for us as a society. And we'll take a look at some of that today. A quick word about myself. I'm the Executive Director of Conserve Wildlife Foundation, a nonprofit that works to protect at-risk wildlife. I'm the author of the book Wild New Jersey, Nature Adventures in the Garden State, and I previously taught environmental communications at Rutgers for 8 years. Conserve Wildlife Foundation, while we are focused primarily in New Jersey, we do work across the hemisphere to protect the species that need it most, everything from inspiring comebacks like the bald eagle and peregrine falcon to species struggling to hang on like bats, shorebirds, and horseshoe crabs, that some of which we'll take a look at today. And so the story of horseshoe crabs and COVID starts, surprisingly enough, in the far off jungles where land was cleared, and from that, at least as far as we all our latest understanding, that interaction with wildlife, that unhealthy interaction, has been the cause of our zoonotic diseases for decades now. And COVID was no different. When COVID-19 came along, it was some combination of wildlife species interacting with humans in a way that they hadn't before, with a proximity they hadn't before. And this combination of illegal forest clearing, illegal bushmeat trade and wildlife trade, wet markets where you have a variety of species in very close proximity and to both people and to each other that in the natural world you would not find. All of that is a recipe for disaster. And from there, COVID-19, we woke up one day, for most of us, one day last March, to find that we were living on the set of Contagion, right down to many of the details from the movie a decade earlier, everything from the frantic scientists and safety personnel doing what they could to the information or the misinformation specialists getting in the way. The whole journey was there. The one thing the movie didn't go into, though, was the wildlife role. And that role was a significant one, as we'll take a look, not only in the zoonotic causes, but in ultimately our salvation. And so, of course, Corona spread around the globe. At the last count, we were looking at over 33 million cases in the US, over 174 million cases worldwide, and countless people, unfortunately, have died from it. So it has, to say it has disrupted life for the past 14, 15 months would be a severe understatement. As we all know, it sent many of us indoors for months, particularly last spring. And in a weird way, nature ended up being a surprisingly significant comfort for countless people, both in engaging with nature in their own yards, suddenly realizing just how good it felt to watch the migrating songbirds arrive, to see animals they hadn't seen before now that they were home, now that they were maybe in a sense more attuned to the world around them, the natural world around them. And also, it also turned people to wildlife through our technology, that thankfully we had the opportunity to enjoy things like webcams and so many countless videos of wildlife around the world, wildlife in many places returning to areas that had long been off limits because of the decreased human activity. And certainly for our experience of nature, particularly during the peaks of COVID, we found a much different environment where a family get together or a group hike or any kind of group activities were, if they were held at all, were drastically different with social distancing and protective gear. And of course, the social distancing, we had help. Well, you know, how do you remember if you're standing far enough away from the person in front of you in Target? You know, the clear way that any of us use, of course, is to picture a 26-year-old Atlantic sturgeon in between us and the person in front of you. And I can't tell you how many times I've been in a line like that and realized I was only about the distance of a 20-year-old sturgeon, silly me, and so I had to back up a step. So nonetheless, we as a society, we do what we can, and nature has been a comfort throughout it. And yet, nowhere was nature and wildlife more of a comfort than literally in everything that went into the vaccine development and the ultimate arrival last December 2020, of the first successfully tested vaccines. And from there, all of the people, including probably many people on this call, many of us would be surprised to know that every single person who received the vaccine has, in some very significant way, a horseshoe crab to thank for that. Without the horseshoe crab, we would absolutely not in the US have been able to develop and particularly to approve the vaccine for human use. It's the only way, and we'll get into this in more detail later, it's the only way that that any vaccine, any intravenous device, any implants, anything that enters our bloodstream can be tested for bacterial contamination is with horseshoe crab blood, and more specifically with a component called lysate, Limulus amoebocyte lysate, which is only found in the Atlantic horseshoe crab. And to date, there is no approved in the US, no approved alternative for testing. That's something we're going to be talking about as well. So what is it about the horseshoe crab? How did this creature that many of you have probably seen, either alive or dead, along our coasts, along the Atlantic coast? Many others may have seen it in other countries along the coast in parts of Asia, and others may have never seen it. Well, what is so special about this creature? Well, for starters, it's one of our most ancient creatures of significant size that we have in the world. Horseshoe crabs were swimming our seas looking back at an age not only before the dinosaurs, they predated the dinosaurs by many eons, but they even predated flowering plants and flying insects. Now think about that. When we think about early stages of the world, those are so much a kind of foregone conclusion. We think back, wow, the Ice Age, that was a long time ago, or the dinosaurs tends to be the furthest most of us, if we even think about it, how far we go back. And the horseshoe crab predated all that and then some. So swimming in these archaic seas, the horseshoe crab proved to be remarkably resilient. It not only, as many of its closest cousins at the time, trilobites and other creatures, ultimately failed to survive, the horseshoe crab just kept swimming and doing its thing. Very little unchanged since those days. And as a result, this ancient creature has no real clear, close relative in the modern world. It's technically, despite its name, it's a closer relative to the spider and the scorpion, but it's not even particularly close to them. It's been so separated evolutionarily from all the other existing species. And as a result, the unique qualities it has cannot be found elsewhere in the natural world. You know, and to just kind of put a point in it, we're going to be talking about the migratory shorebirds, and Stephanie Feigin will go into some of the great studies that she's been leading on some of those. But just as migratory shorebirds today feast on horseshoe crab eggs, many scientists and others believe that flying reptiles, such as pterodactyls, may have done the same, had the same kind of behavior eons ago with horseshoe crab eggs, which is just stunning to think about, and something that next time you see a horseshoe crab along the beach, one more thing to think about. And so today we're going to be talking mostly about the Atlantic horseshoe crab, because the Atlantic horseshoe crab is what is not only has been driving our studies for decades now, but has been the center point of the vaccine development and of the different biomedical approaches that I've mentioned. That being said, there are 3 additional species in Southeast Asia. And unfortunately, each of those, like the Atlantic horseshoe crab, is declining severely as well. And with lower numbers to start, at least as of a few decades ago, they had even less wiggle room. And so those numbers are dropping, which we're going to come back to later, what that means for us. And, you know, I would say, thankfully, geography can tell the difference between the species. As you can see on the bottom, most of them are very, very similar. And the blood components are similar, slightly different, but similar as well, which we'll talk about as well. And as I mentioned, in Asia, those 3 species have declined significantly, not only for overharvesting, but also for use for an approved vaccine and other bacterial testing in biomedical procedures in Eastern countries. The horseshoe crab, the Asian species of the horseshoe crab, have been used in that, and they've declined so sharply that future is very much in jeopardy, as well as some of the questions about our own. Here in the US, you can find horseshoe crabs everywhere from just north of Maine in New Brunswick, all the way down to the Yucatan Peninsula, and which is fitting because the Yucatan is one of those mass extinctions that the horseshoe crab survived when 95 to 99% of other species didn't survive those 5 mass extinctions. The horseshoe crab did. You had the asteroid hitting the Yucatan, you had the Deccan Flats erupting in India, you had all these worldwide cataclysms, and yet the horseshoe crab kept swimming its way along. And now today, here we have in Delaware Bay, situated between the state of Delaware and southwestern New Jersey, you have around 23 beaches where you have active and reliable horseshoe crab populations to varying degrees of health, and all in some kind of state of decline. And the significance of that cannot be overstated. The horseshoe crab eggs, which in many ways resemble a kind of caviar, they lay in mass numbers. They spawn every May here along the Delaware Bay. And these mass numbers of eggs are designed in such a way that almost all of them go towards the food web. The ones that survive become the next generation of horseshoe crabs, but it's a hard road to that point. Their role in the food web is virtually unparalleled. We here in New Jersey, as Stephanie will talk about, look at primarily the shorebirds that depend on them. That's always been our largest focus because we have these imperiled and endangered shorebirds like the red knot. But the reality is horseshoe crab eggs fuel, in many ways, the whole ecosystem of the Delaware Bay. They fuel everything from the Atlantic eel to flounder to weakfish and striped bass. They fuel diamondback terrapins and sea turtles. We've seen with weakfish a decline that has paralleled the decline in horseshoe crab eggs, just as we've seen the decline in shorebirds parallel that decline in horseshoe crabs. And so in many ways, as the horseshoe crab goes, so goes many other species around it. Diamondback terrapins are another one that has suffered from the great decline of horseshoe crabs. So to say they're a keystone of the Delaware Bay ecosystem would be putting it mildly. That being said, the shorebirds have been the largest focus. And while I'm not going to go into right now the different studies we do, Stephanie is much better suited to talk firsthand about some of the great studies that have been done for the past decades in Delaware Bay and in recent years, newer ones as well. The journey of the shorebirds to get here for those horseshoe crab eggs is also by itself, if you took out the COVID connection, this in itself is just a fascinating story. You have red knots, ruddy turnstones, various kinds of sandpiper and other shorebirds flying from the furthest south tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego. So you look at a globe, the first land you come to when your finger comes north from Antarctica. From there all the way every May to spend their time, and other parts in South America as well, flying every May to spend a couple of weeks or less, hopefully, depending on how well they can fuel up here in Delaware Bay. They fuel up on energy almost entirely from those horseshoe crab eggs. And that journey in itself would be a fantastic one, except that's just the first leg. Once they have gained their energy, hopefully in a regular year, in other years, we're going to hear shortly about what that means when they can't. They use that energy to then fly that second leg, which is going all the way up to the Arctic. And scientists have had polar bear encounters while studying shorebirds in the Arctic, just to give you an idea, literally going from the bottom of the globe to the top every year, then returning. And to put that into perspective, that we can understand, one bird that was banded in one of our surveys, and then later, 2 decades later, recited, and where we have the band information, so we knew its birth and everything else, basically had flown the distance of the equivalent to the moon and back. And this is a red knot the size of a robin you might see outside your window, flying the distance over the course of its life to the moon and nearly back. Just absolutely stunning. And it gives you an idea of just what world-class wildlife spectacles are happening right there in Delaware Bay. Unfortunately, it hasn't been all smooth sailing for the horseshoe crab and those animals that depend on them in recent decades. First, the horseshoe crab was used in the late 1800s through the early to mid 1900s, was used as fertilizer, and it was abundant. It was easy to get. It was easy to load onto boats and barges and backs of trucks, depending on when it was done. Wagons, just fill them with horseshoe crabs. I'm sorry. And they were ideal fertilizer in many ways, just because they were basically free and easy to access. And of course, like humans have done in many ways with a wildlife or nature type resource, we weren't necessarily using it sustainably. Fortunately, the numbers were so great that they were able to weather that use until by the mid 1900s, they were no longer able to, they were no longer a viable alternative. Other cheaper sources came along. And so they had a few decades to recover, but not that long. By the 1990s, horseshoe crabs were being harvested heavily again, this time for bait. They were used for bait, as bait for eel, for whelk, and they were used to such a large degree that we really saw, many millions of crabs over the years used as bait, and we saw their numbers drop precipitously across Delaware Bay. New Jersey did take the lead and was the first state to ban that use for horseshoe crab eggs. Other states haven't followed fully. There's been steps forward, but other steps back. And so the horseshoe, as Stephanie's going to talk more about the current status of horseshoe crabs, the simple way to put it is they have not fully recovered by any stretch from that, even as some of that overharvesting has lessened in certain places. Unfortunately, that harvesting is exacerbated by a couple of things. One, of course, is the bleeding process for vaccines and everything else that we'll talk about. But the other very challenging and potentially devastating impacts on horseshoe crabs come from climate change, which isn't surprising. Horseshoe crabs spend their lives in much of their lives in the tidal zone, in some of the most vulnerable and critical areas along the coast. And Delaware Bay is one of basically you have the water rising, the land subsiding as fast as just about anywhere else on the East Coast. So it's a particularly challenging location for horseshoe crabs. And I should clarify too, while they're found from Maine down to the Yucatan Peninsula, Delaware Bay is by far the single most important and the largest number of horseshoe crabs that everything else kind of revolves around. That is the key. And with Hurricane Sandy, we nearly lost that population entirely. When that hit in late October 2012, it wiped out all of the beaches that the horseshoe crabs depend on Delaware Bay. And it was only through the efforts of organizations like Conserve Wildlife Foundation, American Literal Society, federal agencies, nonprofit foundations, the state agencies, everybody working together, that we were able to rush to build back the beaches in time for the spawning and the shorebirds' arrival the following May. And since then, groups have continued to try to fortify the Delaware Bay shore. This is a remote part of the state. It doesn't get the attention that the Jersey Shore, with its many millions of visitors, gets. It's a much more remote region, and as a result, it can be overlooked. And yet, for the people living there and for the wildlife thriving in that estuary and/or hanging on in that estuary, depending on the species, making those beaches more resilient, whether it's through artificial reefs, whether it's through building up the sand, through all the various different approaches, is one of our best possible ways to protect the horseshoe crab and all those animals and people that depend on it. As I mentioned, the rising seas are dramatically happening in Delaware Bay. You can already see from decades ago, there's places where streets that you could have walked just 50, 60 years ago are now 100 yards out at sea. So you've really seen a very dramatic sinking of the land and rising of the sea there. And I say all this because it just points to the vulnerability of horseshoe crabs and our own vulnerability in depending to such an extent on them. Well, so how does this species that I already mentioned was so unique in today's world? Their blue blood, which has that limulus amoebocyte lysate component in it, their blue blood clots around any kind of bacterial contamination. As you can see here, any kind of bacterial contamination, it immediately clots, and as a result, it serves as a great way to basically pinpoint any kind of contaminant before, whether it be a vaccine or some kind of intravenous device, would move on to the next stage in the approval process. So it captures what could be really serious or even potentially fatal medical impacts before that vaccine or whatever else gets further along in the process. And in doing so, and it is the only way, as I mentioned, the only way to test for these contaminants that's approved in the U.S. And so the way that it works, there's a handful of labs that gather these crabs and then bleed them. They're supposed to only bleed a certain amount. Some of the big question marks, though, relate to the fact that there's no transparency in the industry, and that published reviews of the bleeding range up to even 10 times higher than what is claimed or what is supposed to be done in terms of mortality. In theory, they bleed the crabs and then return them to the wild within a short period of time. The problem is, even if the crabs don't die in the lab, do they die as soon as they get back out there? Are they returned to a similar region? Are they returned somewhere totally different? There's just very little transparency, and as a result, it's hard to truly assess the impacts of this on horseshoe crabs. And while, at least speaking for Conserve Wildlife Foundation, we applaud the use of horseshoe crabs in this role because there isn't a currently approved substitute. One of the things we'll be talking about later, and Stephanie will go into detail later, is about how we can find alternatives and/or make a much stronger process and a much more reliable process. So we're limiting the actual impacts to horseshoe crab numbers that are already so vulnerable. As you see, we're talking, over hundreds of thousands that are harvested for their blood, and over 100,000 die each year. And so, again, though, we just need more clarity on those numbers. The alternative right now is recombinant factor C, RFC as it's known. And this has been approved in Europe, this alternative, this synthetic alternative. In the US, though, even though there was an opportunity last year to approve it, the feds did not approve it. And so we are still relying solely on horseshoe crab blood, as opposed to in Europe, where they're relying on the synthetic alternative as well. The synthetic, the next step is basically to continue our efforts to try to get it more strongly considered, and to work within the industry as much as we can to try to push that along. Unfortunately, that is one of the biggest obstacles to date in terms of the future of the horseshoe crabs. And Stephanie, right now, I'm proud to introduce, is going to speak about not only the incredible studies and surveys that are being done there, but also about what does the future hold and what are things we can do collectively within organizations and companies as well, and individuals that can help support this.
Thank you, David. Hi, yes, my name is Stephanie Feigin. I'm a wildlife ecologist and partner of this company, Wildlife Restoration Partnerships. Our main focus is the Delaware Bay Shorebird project and the work that we conduct. However, we do conduct work throughout the full flyway for red knots, with our focus primarily being on protecting red knots and all the species they rely on, which includes horseshoe crabs, and then all the habitats they rely on. So just next slide. So I want to start out with an update of, we just wrapped up our 25th year of this research project. It's one of the longest standing research projects in the world, conservation research projects in the world. And while I wanted to start with an update of the season, to dive into an update of what happened this year, really you have to discuss what happened last year and what has happened historically. So David gave you guys a good background on what has happened historically, tragedy of the commons, the complete overuse and misuse of horseshoe crabs throughout the years. And right now, what we're looking at is our horseshoe crab populations are at about a third of the carrying capacity that they should be in the bay, and red knot numbers are about a fourth, possibly lower now. So as you can see from these graphs, as the overharvest began in the late 90s, shorebird populations drastically declined. And when we're saying drastically, we're talking about a decline of, historically, red knot numbers were about 98,000 red knots in the bay. They declined in 2003 through 2005 to about 19,000. There was a slight increase up to 20 to 30,000. And last year we counted another 19,000. This year, the populations took another decline. We counted about 7,000 red knots in the bay this year, which leads us to the questions of why. So next slide, David. So despite the regulations that have been put in place over the years, including a moratorium on bait harvest of horseshoe crabs in the bay, or at least on the New Jersey side, we have not seen an increase in shorebird number or in horseshoe crab numbers. And again, that leads us to why. Where are the other threats coming in, and where's the other take from their population? David talked a bit about that, and some of it is, in fact, the lysate industry. And so to answer some of the questions of what might be going on now, one reason the shorebirds probably declined had to do with a direct impact from last year. So as we have these really much more diminished populations of horseshoe crabs and shorebirds in the bay, every threat to them becomes more significant. They can handle a lot less pressure as it continues to come in, including things like climate change, or just timing mismatches and habitat losses, any threat that's coming into them. So last year, what happened was the water temperatures were colder than ideal for horseshoe crab breeding. While some crabs will breed at a lower temperature threshold, primarily the ideal temperature is 59 degrees Fahrenheit for horseshoe crabs to start coming up to the bay and breeding. And historically, if you have the complete carrying capacity, the numbers of crabs that you should have in the bay, they can handle this kind of a water temperature change. We have historic data from 1986 and 1987 pre-harvest of cold water years and horseshoe crabs still breeding plenty of time. breeding in plenty of time to make enough surface eggs for shorebirds in the bay. When I say enough surface eggs, I mean reaching full saturation levels of 100,000 surface eggs per square meter, whereas currently we're at about 3,000 surface eggs per square meter. So you can go to the next slide, David. So a lot of our work over the last 25 years has been assessing these population declines, how we can recover these populations, institute important protections, understand survivorship, but of both the horseshoe crabs and the shorebirds within Delaware Bay. And when you talk about horseshoe crabs being a keystone species, Delaware Bay is a keystone ecosystem within their flyway. It is the most important stopover during shorebird migration. And it's because of these horseshoe crab eggs. It's like donuts on the beach. They can just fatten up in 2 weeks, sometimes 3 if they need it, and make the weight that they need to get to the Arctic, which is a statistically significant number called P180, which means that they're at 180 grams or more to make enough weight to get to the Arctic and breed in good enough condition. So last year with the cold water temperatures and the horseshoe crabs not breeding until the end of the season, shorebirds arrived at the bay and there was not enough eggs available for them to fatten up. And at the end of the season, about less than 37% of the red knots left the bay in that good condition, that P180 number. So this year we were expecting a decline. We were not expecting quite as drastic of a decline as we looked at. This year, the water temperatures were good. Horseshoe crab breeding was very high. We had an abundance of surface eggs in the bay, but there weren't birds. And so at first, one begins to think, could this be because the shorebirds noticed a lack of eggs last year and moved on to other sites just so that they can make sure that they were making weight and they didn't run into the same issue they did last year? Or there were some weather patterns in South America that did hold them up, possibly change some of their migration path because of the high winds and cyclones. But it's probably more likely that we're looking at this as a direct consequence of last year, and this is a population decline. So if only 37% made it to the Arctic in good condition, that would lead to a significant decline of birds, either not making their full migration up to the Arctic, not being able to breed, and therefore not adding to the population, or dying along their route. So with this project, what are some of the things we do to conduct this research? So you can see these photos here. I just like to include some of these. We conduct different studies. One of them is our cannon netting, which you can see in that lower corner there, where we do bandings of red knots, and we take morphometric data. One of those most important data that we take is their weights, and that goes into their survivorship of that P180 number I discussed. We also put on a unique leg flag, which is a unique code to each bird, and is used in resighting surveys. So scientists go out and recite flocks of shorebirds and record those flags that they can see, which goes into the superpopulation estimate, allowing us to gain some information of the full flyway-wide population. In addition to that, our team conducts aerial surveys, which is how aerial and ground and boat surveys, which is how we were able to each year assess the amount of red knots that are coming to the bay. And then we also, next slide. We also conduct a significant number of habitat restoration projects, which happen from 2012 and currently go on every year. As you can see, this was Thompson's Beach before and then after our restoration. And what this has done is, even though we are not seeing an increase in horseshoe crab populations, we are seeing an increase in egg cluster abundance, as well as some surface egg abundance when, you know, breeding conditions are perfect and at certain beaches. And we believe that's in large part because there's much better habitat for crabs to breed. And they very much are a, if you build it, they will come type species. Next slide. In addition to that, we also have a program called Shorebird Stewards. We protect our beaches here on the New Jersey side of the bay from May 7th to June 7th. It's a team of volunteers that we actually have restricted access to the beaches during that time. And the volunteers sit at the beaches and explain to people coming to see the phenomenon, or even locals, why these areas are restricted and the importance of it. Shorebirds are highly susceptible to disturbance, and it's been a very important part of why many of the shorebirds that are still in the bay are residing primarily on the New Jersey side, in that it costs them you know, days of fat reserves if they're getting up and flying and running away from, or flying away from a dog running at them, or people walking through the flocks. So this is another important study that we conduct every year. Next slide. We also have a number of horseshoe crab studies. One of them is called Return of Favor, which has been incredibly successful. We have volunteers that go out on the beaches at night and flip over overturned horseshoe crabs every night on the beaches. That's just a natural phenomenon that occurs from the wave action in the Delaware Bay. But with populations as low as they are, we really do need every crab possible. And next. And then we also conduct various studies of horseshoe crab abundance, surface egg abundance, as I said, deep cluster abundance, which is when they're actually laying their clutches in the sand. What occurs is, to get the surface egg, other horseshoe crabs coming up at the bay, cobbling, churns up those clusters as well as wave action, and that's how you get the surface egg. But we look at both. We also do horseshoe crab tagging studies to do some resightings efforts, which is a new study that we're working on in the bay. And then we also do abundance surveys to assess population assessment, to assess populations within the bay. Next. Something new. So again, where are we going? What are the next steps? I said this has been going on for 25 years. We're not seeing an increase in horseshoe crabs. And really, the story of the red knot recovering is the story of the horseshoe crab being protected and recovering. And so new, as of the last few years, our team developed the Horseshoe Crab Recovery Coalition. This coalition is a group of 30 plus organizations throughout the country, nonprofits, for-profits, government agencies, et cetera, all coming together with one goal in mind, which is protecting the American horseshoe crab and recovering their populations throughout the entire Atlantic coast. Next slide. So what are our four main goals? As you can see, these are our four main goals listed here. But all of it comes down to one important thing. We need to stop the killing of horseshoe crabs and the improper use. And there's no way to properly save the bay, save this valuable ecosystem, save all the species that rely on the bay and these horseshoe crab eggs without stopping the killing of horseshoe crabs. And that includes us. That includes our need for, you know, horseshoe crabs to be around and be abundant so that they can help us with things like a coronavirus vaccine, or honestly, any vaccine, any implant that goes into your system. But we have other options, and it's incredible that we have been able to learn about this this use of lysate to protect human health. But recombinant factor C was developed from lysate and is a very effective. It's actually being used by Eli Lilly currently in 4 of their drugs that are on the market. And it's just not been approved by US Pharmacopoeia, but as David said, it has been approved by other pharmacopoeia around the world. So yeah, the 4 goals are to manage the bait fisheries and remove the other killings of horseshoe crabs, really, which is bycatch and other components, including lysate, and then restoring the populations throughout the Atlantic coast so that these areas and these needs and these other species can be resilient in the future. Next slide. So really, the question that we're asked all the time is, what can we do? How can we help? As you know, or as I just discussed, there are a number of volunteer opportunities, engaging the community, being a shorebird steward, being a return a favor volunteer, but it's also about advocating for these horseshoe crabs, removing the stigma that they are just garbage species and unneeded, spreading the word, becoming part of the Horseshoe Crab Recovery Coalition, contributing to our efforts, and just understanding the importance of this incredible species.
Thank you, Stephanie. And this, our website, conservewildlifenj.org, has some great information about the horseshoe crab, and about the shorebirds that depend on them, in addition to the Horseshoe Crab Coalition group. And I'm sorry, what's the website for that, Stephanie? Do you know offhand?
Yeah, it's it's horseshoecrabrecovery.org. So it's
Okay.
Yeah, we should.
Gotcha. Yeah, so we invite you to check out our websites for more information, and obviously feel free to contact us as well. But we're also happy to take any questions that you have, and appreciate the opportunity to share what's really remarkable, but a remarkable story, but also one with a lot at stake, for both people and for, as Stephanie mentioned, the entire Delaware Bay ecosystem, which is really goes even far beyond the bay itself in terms of its impact on the natural world.
Thank you both, David and Stephanie, for a fascinating presentation. I think you got a lot of folks here on the line fired up about horseshoe crabs. I know that I am. So we've got a lot of questions coming in, but we'll get to as many as we can. So I guess we'll go ahead and start off by probably the most popular question. Do we know what's standing in the way of kind of approving that RFC synthetic alternative to the horseshoe crab blood in the U.S.?
So yes, to be frank, where there is money to be made, it is hard to make a change. The bleeding companies are making a significant amount of money off of bleeding horseshoe crabs. And because of something called the Magnuson-Stevens Act Rule of 3, they don't need to release their data of how many crabs they're bleeding, and even full information of how many crabs are being killed. And they don't need to release how much money they are making off of the bleeding of the horseshoe crabs. But it has been documented that a female horseshoe crab would go for $350 per crab, per liter of blood from that crab, whereas they can just take them for free out of the ocean or off the beach. So again, unfortunately, where there's money to be made, it will likely be abused.
Okay, I was afraid that was the answer, but thank you for answering that. And then just kind of horse crab, horseshoe crab anatomy and so forth. We've got a few questions coming in regarding that. Two quick ones. How do you tag a horseshoe crab? And then also, what is the best way to flip a horseshoe crab back over, as we saw with the volunteers helping out with that?
I could talk about, you know what, I'll talk about quickly about the anatomy, and then if you could talk about the tagging, Stephanie. You know, so the horseshoe crab, as I mentioned, it's so unique in terms of its anatomy. It has 9 eyes, including 2 compound eyes, which, you know, similar to a fly, or you can picture some of the insects with that compound eye. They have 10 legs, and their tail is called a telson, and their tail is under many circumstances, it's able to right itself through the telson. It also helps propelling itself around, and also during the spawning activity, which can resemble a giant pile up, so to speak, of the crabs, especially on full moon or new moon nights in May and even early June. But that structure, that telson often proves inadequate if the horseshoe crab is caught in rubble, or if it's stranded so high above the tide line at such an angle that it's unable to right itself. And you saw maybe in one of the photos that often when you see a stranded horseshoe crab, you might see lines going around in a circle because it's trying in vain to right itself. And that's where the volunteers on a program like Return the Favor come into play. It's one of the great volunteer programs because not only is it about a dozen or so nonprofits combining on this, but it's one of the most simple things. Literally anybody can do it. Anybody of any age who can walk on one of these beaches can save lives of the horseshoe crabs just by flipping it over. But the banding, Stephanie, that's a great question.
So the best way to flip over a horseshoe crab, as David talked about, the telson is very important to crabs. So a lot of people will grab a crab by the tail, which is not something you should do. They have the ability to break their tail off, and it's also just very delicate. So it's best to just grab the crab by the edges of the shell and gently flip it over that way. And the tagging is actually done quite similarly. It sounds like it would not be, it sounds like it would possibly hurt, but the shell of a crab is just a hard exoskeleton. So we actually just stick the tag through the shell, again on the outside, in the back outside there. And you use a drill and you're just putting the tag through there, and it stays forever, similar to like how, you know, snails and barnacles attach to the crab as well.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. And one question that came in kind of more on the human dynamic of things. In your all's experience, you know, through the pandemic and so forth, did you see an uptick in participation from the public wanting to get involved in such things, or did it kind of remain steady, or can you speak to what you've noticed over the last 15 months or so?
Yeah, I mean, I would say from our perspective and many of the groups we partner with as well, we saw more. It was definitely one of the few silver linings, is that we saw more interest and you know, rediscovered passion for wildlife and nature than we could have imagined. You know, we had a combination of people seeking out. For instance, we run wildlife webcams for bald eagle, peregrine falcon, and osprey. We had way more visitors than ever before, way more interaction and commentary and, you know, social media and online through that. So I think people really, you know, in a sense, found the best case alternative, considering they didn't feel safe going outside. But conversely too, I think just like with anything, you know, when something's taken away from you, you feel it hits home more what you're missing. And I think we saw that last spring around the country. Really, we saw that people, once nature seemed to be something that they couldn't necessarily enjoy the way they wanted to, or were kept from, all of a sudden you had more people outdoors than ever before. You know, you had to such a degree that, you know, around this time last year, you know, I never saw more people jogging, walking their dog, pushing baby stroller, bird watching, hiking than ever before. And I don't think it was even comparable in many places.
Yeah, we saw the same. We were able to conduct our work last year despite the pandemic, and volunteers were allowed to come out for various projects, you know, as long as they were working solo. But there was a lot of interest in being involved in these projects, being out in nature, and a lot of people coming and utilizing the bay, actually more than we've seen, just wanting to go birding and see this phenomenon and understand more about it.
And actually, just jumping on that really quick, to Stephanie's and her team's credit, for them to be able to do, they had you might have seen in one of the photos, there's a large group of their scientists and volunteers from around the world kind of enjoying the end of a season in the past. Last year, they had only Stephanie and her team was just a handful of people, you know, and literally had to try to maintain the studies that have been going on for decades, and somehow they did it. So I definitely commend you and your team for that, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Excellent. So, you know, to show kind of the red knots a little love, we've got a question about them as well. So how does 25 years of banding impact a population and the bird's ability to reach their peak weight? Have any studies been done on the stress on birds from being handled so often?
So the birds are handled actually very minimally, you know, bird banding has been happening for decades and decades. There's been a number of studies on any impact that a band or a flag would have on a bird, with zero impact found. The impact happens. When we make a catch, it's of 50 birds, and there's statistical analysis that goes into what that weight would equate to for the full population. So we're not banding every bird, all, you know, 100,000 that historically were in the bay. But it's a subset of the population. We found no impact to our work. The only no impact to their breeding or survivorship success. There is a minimal impact in that they're not feeding for the 5 minutes that the bird is in the hand, but they're released immediately, and then able to gain that fat reserve back. And to that point, the importance of continuing this work and the information that we have been able to understand from this 25-year-long study has led us to these moments here of more protection for the bay than ever has been provided, more protection to horseshoe crabs and understanding than has ever been before, and even more protection for the red knot. That's how they were listed as federally threatened. So without that research, we wouldn't be anywhere near where we are.
Great. Here's kind of a couple practical questions, I guess you might say. Are there any citizen science apps out there, tools to use for horseshoe crab sightings or monitoring that the public might be able to participate with?
Yes, there is a site called, I believe it's iNaturalist, and there's a section for horseshoe crab counting throughout I can actually pull up the website and try and send it in the group chat, that allows people to, you know, just count horseshoe crabs throughout the Atlantic Flyway. There's also a website for the tags that we put out on horseshoe crabs. If you see a crab on the bay and you want to do a resighting, it actually has the website on the tag itself. You take a picture, there's a form, and the wonderful thing is they send you back a really, really beautiful horseshoe crab pin. So that's a very fun citizen science project to get involved with. As well as like I said, being a shorebird steward or being involved in return a favor, all those things are open to the public.
Yeah, and actually, I would say even more generally, between sites like iNaturalist and Seek and other apps, um, there's never been a better time and a more valuable time to be contributing in citizen science. So many studies now are accentuated by the fact that anybody from the public with an iPhone can document species and much easier than ever. Similar with different cams, remote cams that are now much more inexpensive than they were even a decade ago, to where they can be placed in areas where wildlife is identified, where in some cases documenting the presence of a species that wasn't even known to be there. So I do encourage both individuals and then companies to consider pursuing citizen science type projects on, anything from, as Stephanie mentioned, from horseshoe crabs and shorebirds to, pollinators, birds, mammals, etc.
Excellent. We have a number of member companies that are located around the Delaware Bay, so hopefully, there and beyond can begin participating. A question that I also had during the presentation, if kind of the current harvest regulations aren't really resulting in that increase in the horseshoe crabs population, what are some other things that can be done to kind of protect and promote the species?
Well,
You
I'm
can go.
sorry, Stephanie, you took it.
Well, so we did discuss the importance of moving to things like the RFC, or putting regulations on different bycatch scenarios within fisheries. But the moratorium that we have here in the New Jersey side of Delaware Bay is only there. So horseshoe crabs do reside in other locations along the Atlantic coast. And there are quotas on how many horseshoe crabs they can take for bait harvest, and actually, male only harvest or set landings. But the important thing to understand is there's no way to tell a crab that it can only reside on the New Jersey side of the Delaware Bay, and that's the only place that it's protected. It will, they don't understand state lines. So some of those landings that are allowed in other states may be Delaware Bay crabs, etc. So continuing to work with advocating for protection for horseshoe crabs in all the important areas along the Atlantic coast, and putting restrictions on or no bait harvest at all. There are other uses, other bait uses that we can have. There's even synthetic bait, and or even just having the goal in mind that we want to manage for the population that we need to have everything be sustainable, and not manage for this diminished population of a scarcity regime. And so if we were to put heavier restrictions on something and allow the crab to recover, then you can have a certain amount of harvest or lysate being regulated and taken once we are at a population that can handle that kind of a threat.
Yeah, and just to add on that, one thing that is being done well in New Jersey, Stephanie talked about, was shorebird stewards. It's also a very simple way to manage. There's a very defined time frame that the horseshoe crabs are spawning, and that the shorebirds are present, and so it doesn't conflict with direct summer season when beaches might be most widely populated. So it's a simple approach, but it really does pay dividends. Where you're talking during flyovers in recent years, 90+% of the birds were on the New Jersey side, despite solid habitat on both the New Jersey and Delaware side. But the big difference between them being that one side is, as Stephanie talked about, being constantly disrupted by, people walking around, dog walkers, etc. And the other side, actually the birds being in a protected place. And so that goes a long way, along with the other remedies that Stephanie mentioned.
Thank you for that. And, unfortunately, we're up at the top of the hour. There's several more questions hanging out there. So, our audience was very engaged. So just want to thank you both, David and Stephanie, for a great session. And thanks to everybody for joining us. So coming up in 30 minutes, please join us for our next session, the Human and Cultural Dimension, a discussion on environmental education and training with the Earth Lab, Freeport-McMoRan, and Bat Conservation International. So hope to see you in 30 minutes, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.